Thank you, everybody, for coming along to this second talk on terrestrial invertebrates. Hopefully, those of you who attended the first talk will recall how we ended, and we ended with a long list of invertebrate species that had been recorded, potentially from a site that we looked at using a number of the different techniques. And the idea today is to sort of follow that through to look at how we would analyze that list using Pantheon and get to know it a little bit more. So what we're looking to do is to take a reasonably deep dive into Pantheon, which is some analysis software developed by Natural England and the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. We're going to look at how it developed from an MS Excel tool. We'll look at specific assemblage types, which are basically the assemblages that come out of Pantheon once we've put the lists in. We'll look at some of the benefits of using Pantheon and how it's improved on its forerunner called ISIS. We'll talk about that. And we'll focus a little bit on how some of the outputs from Pantheon can help us to steer management. And we'll also look at where Pantheon is a little less effective than it might be, and possibly what's going to happen in the future. For those of you who missed last week's talk, just a little introduction to me. I currently work for Natural England in citizen science. I've been involved in entomology professionally for actually a bit longer than 20 years. First as a freelancer, doing work for government agencies, charities and consultancies. I then spent some time at the Field Studies Council and ran an entomological project there, which worked with people to learn the skills they need to become entomologists. We concentrated on flies, bees, beetles, bugs and spiders, and spent 4 years showing a variety of people how to identify those species, and some of them became incredibly good, which is fantastic. And some of them now are teachers in their own right, county recorders, and input into the national recording schemes. So it was a really successful project. We also authored a number of county atlases for Shropshire during that time. I authored one on crane flies and one on shield bugs. And we also had a couple of other entomologists involved who authored atlases on Aculeate Hymenoptera, the bees, wasps and ants, and one on Microlepidoptera. When I left the FSC, I joined Natural England as a field entomologist in the field unit and carried out that work till pretty recently, and moved to a different part of Natural England now. In 2020, sort of over lockdown really, I published an article naming 24 new species to science from Cameroon, following a Winston Churchill Fellowship, and since then 1 new species to Corsica, which is part of some voluntary work I've done for the Paris Museum. I'm really proud and happy to say that I learned my entomological trade volunteering at Liverpool World Museum's Entomological department, and I can't stress that enough. Right, so basically the plan for this evening is we'll talk through this presentation, and then we'll go on to the website itself and have a play around. But to give it some context, we'll talk about the origins of Pantheon, which is something called ISIS, and we'll look at the new dawn of Pantheon, and as I say, we'll have a poke around and see how it works. So originally, ISIS was a computer application, as I said earlier, in MS Excel for recognizing invertebrate assemblage types in species lists. It was designed to assess the results of standardized methodology used by Common Standard Monitoring in England on SSSIs, but started to find a life outside of that original use. it started to be used by a number of consultants and other entomologists who sort of got hold of it, and it got sort of spread around. I suppose you'd say it went viral in today's terminology, and started to turn up being used all over the place, even outside of England. So it's quite an interesting development in entomology. So ISIS worked at two distinct levels. Firstly, at a specific assemblage type level, or SAT. So anytime you hear the word SAT tonight, that's what we'll mean. And at a broad assemblage type level, BAT or BATs. Again, anytime you hear the word BATs, it won't be these sort of flappy winged things that come out at night. It will be broad assemblage types. But we'll soon be able to forget those because they didn't last. So what's the difference between a SAT and a BAT? So the SATs give a very specific relationship between an invertebrate species and its precise habitat. So for instance, this picture wing fly, Campyglossa, is only found on salt marsh where sea aster grows. And similar insects to that particular species of fly make up the assemblage. And in this case, we're looking at the M311 salt marsh and brackish marsh assemblage, which is made up of beetles and flies and bugs and a few other things. One of those flies being Campyglossa. Excuse me. Whereas bats gave a broader, less specific relationship between a species and a general habitat. So for instance, the cranefly Symplecta stictica is super abundant on salt marsh. Anybody who's ever swept a net over salt marsh, you can find hundreds of them in your net at the same time, at certain times of year. But it's also found outside of salt marsh in other types of wetland habitat, such as swamp, peat bog, wet woodland, marsh, and a few others. So we can say that Campyglossa and Symplecta are different, and that Campyglossa has a very high fidelity to salt marsh, whereas Symplecta has a low fidelity to salt marsh. So that in a nutshell is the difference between a SAT species and a BAT species. We'll come back to this slide later on in the presentation, because if you've not encountered this sort of stuff before, it can be confusing. So you would open up your Excel table, and here's where you would input data. You would cut and paste your species list into the left-hand column under the word species, and on the right-hand side, you see you've got values waiting to happen there with the BATs and the SATs, but also a level of rarity. And it was based on this data set. This is obviously just a tiny bit of it that sat behind the workings of the Excel sheet, which had all the species coded in with the family, the species name, and with the BAT and the SAT codes and the rarity scores, and where that information had been drawn from. And a lot of this came from Recorder 3. So that sort of sat behind it. So when you entered your data, and here's just a tiny bit of data, this is what you would see. So you get the species name down the left-hand side, the BAT value down the left, the SAT value in the middle, and the rarity score down the right. You can see that a couple of species there haven't been recognized, where it says #NA. And that basically, they're species that weren't coded at the time and maybe still not be coded. In fact, most of the muscids and tachinids and things like that are still not coded. Or where a value is naught, it's generally a commoner species that isn't part of a SAT, maybe part of a BAT, or it may have a very low rarity score, like the Bembidian there, line 57, which doesn't have a rarity score. And then on another screen, you would get a little output table like this that told you how many species you had of each particular bat or sat, a percentage of the national species pool. If it was in favourable condition, your site, due to the sort of working out that the Excel table did, you'd have a little FAV in the condition column. And it gave you that information, and that pretty much was it. But it was a simple little tool that enabled you to assess species lists and say, are they favourable, are they not favourable, based on the methodology being carried out under Common Standards Monitoring. So that's what ISIS did. But there were issues with ISIS. Fundamentally, the name. If anybody wants to put in the chat who said events did or events, I'll be most impressed if you get that very quickly. So the name was an issue, but also the fact that it was in an Excel spreadsheet was an issue, because the information that sat behind ISIS needed to be updated every now and again. It was updated a few times, which means you have issues of version control. Do people have the most updated version? Are they using the most updated version with the most up-to-date information? The ISIS database was correct with statuses up to 2010, but a lot of those statuses were based on the Red Data Book from 1987, and those from Recorder. So it was quite quickly becoming out of date, and that obviously threatened the viability of it for people to use. So it was decided that the tool could work well online, and Pantheon was born. And this is what the early version looked like. It had the Natural England logo on it, the old Natural England lime green logo that everybody hated. It had some hieroglyphics on the left-hand side, which was sort of down to one of the key developers of the project, who was very much into his Egyptian and Greek mythology, and named the various parts of it. That was soon to change, and I don't know whether he's ever forgiven Natural England and CEH for taking those away, but the most important thing that happened was that broad assemblage types were dropped, with only the specific assemblage types remaining. And that seems to have been down to the validity of the science behind the broad assemblage types. I think that's a shame, personally. I always did, always have, because the broad assemblage types were really, really useful, particularly for sites that weren't SSSIs, and they gained currency amongst planners and consultants doing that sort of work. And one thing planners like is a category. So if you could say this bit of ground, this bit of land, this habitat has a broad assemblage type, then that is a bit of an advantage in terms of of correctly mitigating for it. And it's unlikely that land outside of SSSIs, if they're surveyed properly, are going to come up with specific assemblage types unless they're really, really valuable bits of habitat, and they're probably already going to be protected anyway. So that's a bit of a shame, but it is where we are. And there are other ways of trying to assess the old broad assemblage type scores, but it's not as easy. That also impacted on Natural England as well, because not all SSSIs were scored by specific assemblage type. Some were scored by broad assemblage type. And once that's in the documentation, it's quite hard to change that. So there was internal impact as well. But the good news was that lots of extra species were coded in, and Pantheon is a massively more powerful tool than ISIS ever was, as hopefully we'll see a little bit later on. So how do you put data in? Well, that's something we'll look at in a little while. We'll also look at a few case studies based on survey work that the Natural England Field Unit did that I was involved with in some part on some of those sites. So we'll look at ash ranges in Surrey, which is a heathland SSSI. We'll look at Attingham Park SSSI in Shropshire with a data set that actually didn't come from us. It came from a person who was carrying out a PhD looking at whether there was a connection between beetles and sudden oak death. And they put sort of forerunners of vane traps out in Attingham Park, and so had all this data, and we were able to use that and demonstrate something with it, which we'll look at shortly. We'll look at Morecambe Bay SSSI in Lancashire, which was a job I did mostly on my own. It wasn't the whole of the SSSI, because anyone who knows Morecambe Bay SSSI, it's absolutely massive. It goes for a long, long way up the coast, but I was surveying a couple of little bits of it, and I'll talk you through that when we get there. And then the most recent is some work we've done on the arable margins in the Brecks in Norfolk around Thetford. And none of those sites are SSSIs, but they are supported by agri-environment schemes. And the farmers there are sort of clubbing together to carry out a sort of landscape scale scheme to support the arable margins for a whole range of species, plants and invertebrates. So we'll have a quick look at that as well, and what the data shows us. I thought I'd just introduce you to those sites. This is Ash Ranges. It's a really, really large bit of Ministry of Defence land. It's not the sort of site that you can just wander onto. It's an active shooting range. There are all sorts of military exercises that sort of take part on it over the year. And when we surveyed it, we could only really get on at occasional weekends and bank holidays. So that was a job that made us very popular with our families, having to go, spend the day working on your bank holiday. You can see that there are some stripes that cross the landscape there, where the habitat has been interfered with a bit. They were done by the local wildlife trust, the Surrey Wildlife Trust, who manage part of it on behalf of the Ministry of Defence. And those areas provide some warmer ground, some bare ground, and that's really, really useful for a whole range of different invertebrates. You can also see there's heather at different height levels. There's a bit of scrub in the sort of immediate landscape, and woodland further away, and that's still all part of the base, or the reserve. A really interesting site, and there's lots of evidence that it is used. There are little areas that where they target practice, and there were a couple of times we were there, and there are all sorts of things going on. So quite an interesting site to work on. Anybody involved in this sort of thing, think of the risk assessment that we had to compile. Here's another view. Again, you can see we've got bare ground, we've got relatively mature heather, but also you can see some of the tracks going off into the distance where tractors have been round and have cut sort of random paths around the site So you've got different levels of heather facing in different directions. So some of those areas are sort of directly south facing. You can see the scrub and the bracken and various other things. It's a nice heathland site. There are wetter bits there. You have the raft spider on site and a variety of other things. Some nice wetland flies, all sorts of bits and pieces. And also other things like smooth snake is resident on the site. And when we were there, there was a sort of monitoring of the reptiles going on, and we were fortunate enough to see smooth snake. And there on the right hand side, you've got the green huntsman spider, close up with its eyes. It's quite a spectacular big green thing. I hadn't seen it before. So really nice site. The second site that I mentioned is Attingham Park. This is a National Trust site, and you can sort of, from that picture, you sort of get the feel of what it's like. Very impressive house. Lots and lots of visitors come to sort of walk around the house and the grounds. For us, obviously, the most interesting thing is the grounds, the Triple SI. There's a deer park with some quite ancient trees. This is one of them, and they're scattered around with more recent woodland there also. You can see behind there's a bit of a plantation. But there are sufficient numbers of veteran trees like that one to make it of high importance nationally. It's within the top 100 sites for deadwood invertebrates. So this was the site that the lady was carrying out the survey, the research for sudden oak death. The third site is Morecambe Bay. That was the nice bit with the view out over into the Lake District. On sunny days, it was very pleasant. Most of it was more like this, and you saw this photograph last time. Me using the Pooter of Doom to suck up a whole range of invertebrates. A lot of the site was sheep grazed quite heavily, and then other bits had no real management to it, so it was a bit of a hodgepodge, but ultimately quite enjoyable to be out and about. And then finally, the Breck's arable margins. I've just got a couple of the margins to show you, but we surveyed and are still surveying quite a number, and a lot of them sort of look like this. They're cropped with a variety of crops. In this case, I think it's barley that was being grown there, but some are cropped with a range of other things, and some have pigs on them or whatever else. And generally the idea is that the margins are ploughed annually, or in some cases every other year, and they're just left to get on with it. And they hold a whole range of really important species. Botanically, they're highly important and significant. And as we found out, they're also very good for invertebrates, because generally the soils that they are on are very sandy and friable. And so you get an awful lot of coastal species as well turning up in the Brecks on these margins. Here's another view of one of the flowery areas. Lots of areas like this on the margins, so very good for Aculeate Hymenoptera and a number of other things. So that just sort of gives you a background to the sites we're going to be talking about when we get onto the website. So a reminder that SATs give a very specific relationship between the invertebrate species in question and the precise habitat that it's found on. So the assemblage types, there are 26 different ones. There are a number that are arboreal in nature, so tree-related assemblages, and they all are prefaced with an A. So you'll start to see some of these codes bit more regularly over the remaining part of the talk. So an example is A211. Those that are prefaced by an F are the field layer codes. So they're generally grassland or heathland, that sort of habitat. The maritime habitats are prefaced with an M, and then the wetland habitats are prefaced with a W, such as W213. And we'll go through these in a bit more detail, or certainly a representation of some of them shortly on the website. The assemblage types, these are the ones we'll look at. We'll look at the Swagnum Bog one, the scrub heath and moorland one, the rich flower resource one, otherwise known as a pollinator one, the scrub edge one, the bark and sapwood decay one, the stream and river margin one, and the salt marsh and traditional brackish marsh one, which is obviously the one I would have used on the salt marsh at Morecambe Bay. Okay, so I will close that down, and we'll enter Pantheon. So this is what the Pantheon website looks like now. The random sort of hieroglyphs have been replaced by a scarab beetle. So there's still some connection to its past. And whoever designed the sort of Pantheon logo certainly sort of kept it in touch with its past and the thinking towards it, which is a nice job. It's got a nice background as well around the edge, nice frame. So nice little bit of design work there. But as before, it's an analytical tool developed by Natural England and CEH to assist invertebrate nature conservation in England. So if you remember, for those of you who were on the talk last time, I set you a bit of homework to get yourself a Pantheon account and have a bit of a dive into the different SATs. So we'll do that now. So that will be new to some people, I'm sure, but those of you who were here last time, if you went off and did it, great. If you didn't, no worries. So if you remember, I said go to help, click on glossary, scroll down to SAT, click on SAT, and here we have 3 pages of detail about the SATs. And so the first one we'll look at is Swagnum Bog. So it tells us what the code is. The reason ISIS is still mentioned, the actual database behind Pantheon still uses a sort of a version of the ISIS database, so it was sort of kept on, but it's obviously it doesn't shout in the way that it used to do when it was an Excel file. So it tells us that the code is W312. It's a wetland assemblage. It's had previous names, and that is the case with most of the assemblages as they sort of developed over time. They've been altered and the names have been altered. So it's nice to sort of see that represented here, so that anybody who sees old consultants' reports can find out what they're actually dealing with if they're not that familiar with the assemblages. And so we click on Swagnum, and it takes us to another page where we can learn a little bit more about the Swagnum Bog assemblage. So it says an assemblage type associated with Swagnum bogs, usually in acidic conditions and largely restricted to rain-fed or spring-fed mires. Gives those previous names again. And then it starts to tell us a little bit about the assemblage, and that species richness is pretty low on these sorts of mires, which probably as ecologists, we already know that. And most bogs these days that that we like to come across have had some form of tampering in the past. They may be on the way to recovery, but there's generally been some sort of small scale or large scale peat cutting, which affects the species composition. A bit here about the water chemistry, and a few habitat shots and species shots. The species there of horsefly taken by Stephen Falk. It goes through the potentially important environmental impacts, which in this case are disturbance, peat extraction, afforestation, wind farm infrastructure construction. There could be potential damage caused by surface runoff, nutrient enrichment, that could be atmospheric, and interruption in the groundwater supply, as has happened with so many of our bogs that have lost their lag around the edge and their sort of connectivity to the sort of landscape in terms of their hydrology. Then we start to look at the sampling and assessing the assemblage, the target groups of invertebrates we will go for, so the beetles and bugs. It tells us how to survey these habitats, and ground searching and pond netting are really good methods on peat bogs, as we saw last time, but also pitfall traps as well, and that should be done in the spring and the summer. It also suggests that spot sweeping and sweep netting for flies is a good methodology, as well as potentially putting out water traps. So white or yellow small bowls, shallow trays. Often people use the sort of thing you would buy from the pet shop to put water in for your dog or your cat, and put a little drop of fairy liquid in, and then anything that lands on the water surface will be retained and can be examined and taken out at a later date. And that says spring and summer are the key times of year for that sort of work. Mentions a few other bits of potential survey techniques: sweep nets, hand searches in sphagnum and sieving, which can find some of the smaller beetles and some of the uncommon spiders. Hand searches in sphagnum can also find cranefly larvae and a range of other things. And it probably most importantly for us at this stage of our introduction to Pantheon, it gives us a target species, a target number of species rather. So we are after 8 SAT species within the Swagnum Bog W312 assemblage to show that that site is favourable if we use this sort of methodology. So it's a really good help before you start thinking about using Pantheon, to spend a bit of time looking at these and assessing where you're going to be surveying. Does it fit an assemblage? Does it fit more than one assemblage? Because you know, if we just look at this little photograph here, you've got your Swagnum bog here, but you've also got scrub in the distance, and that will have different invertebrates associated with it. So depending whether you're going to survey a feature like the bog itself, or the edge as a different feature, the sort of things that you can get a bit more information on before you start. And I'll show you another way of doing that a little bit later. So we go back to our beginning page, and we'll look at scrub heath next. It's on page 3, scrub heath and moorland. F003 tells us the previous name as with Swagnum bog, a bit of a description of the habitat. Again, same sort of information, a sort of picture that is representative of the habitat, and some more information. I don't propose to go through all of these and read them line by line, but just to give you an idea of what's here, so that you can do that in your own time. Tells again about the environmental impacts, how to sample and assess, and what to sample and assess. Obviously, the name there, scrub heath and moorland. Scrub heath relates to the lowland sites, whereas moorland is obviously an upland situation, and they need to be tackled slightly differently and at different times of year, as you would imagine. When you get onto moorlands, generally things happen a little bit later in the year than they do to the lowland sites because of temperature and weather and that sort of thing. Rich flower resource next. So this is a sort of pollinator assemblage, but it doesn't have a strong value, and all the species are coded against Aculeate Hymenoptera. So we can't say it's a true pollinator assemblage, because obviously lots of other things pollinate plants, and lots of other things that are relatively important do. But it's quite a useful assemblage to be able to demonstrate to people the value of very flowery places. So woodland rides can show well. Flowery heathlands, we saw a demonstration of one of those on our talk last time. That shows very well. Sandy habitats where there's bare sand and associated open short sward. Some of the other sats can also show the rich flower resource. So it's a handy little assemblage. So next we'll look at scrub edge. Scrub is obviously often dismissed as a valuable habitat, and anyone who's ever done any volunteering has spent many hours cutting down scrub, but it certainly has a value, and it has an assemblage associated with it. And I think we all know what scrub looks like, but we've put a couple of pictures in for us in case we're unsure. It explains about the assemblage, what it comprises of, what could damage those sorts of habitats. So basically, total scrub clearance and cessation of coppice and ride management will have impacts. And it once again gives us the target groups that we're searching for, the field methods, and when to carry out the survey. In this case, it doesn't tell us the score, which is actually 15. But that can be, again, if there's any time that any information is missing like that, we can work it out in other ways, and we'll look at that a little bit later. So we'll look at one of the arboreal assemblages now, bark and sapwood decay. So it tells us that bark and sapwood decay is an assemblage found in and around trees and shrubs, but especially older specimens. So those trees at Attingham Park that we saw in the photograph, and we'll encounter the data from shortly. This is where that ISIS code comes into play. It's had a previous name, and it's been messed around with a little bit and refined over time. It's mostly a beetle assemblage, and so when Gary is emptying and sorting out his vein trap specimens that he was talking about last time, and also I demonstrated a vein trap in some of my photographs last time. Most of the things all of the things for that particular assemblage are Coleoptera related. Some species are associated with saprons, and it's quite a sort of specialist area really to get to understand where to look for the beetles that you're likely to need if you're not vein trapping. That's where vein trapping is sort of really enhanced surveying these sorts of habitats. Again, the potential important environmental impacts, that removal of fallen wood was always quite a common thing to do on estates and other sites. People would take stuff away for firewood. Thankfully, in this slightly more enlightened age, often that fallen wood is now retained, and it certainly is at Attingham and some of the other best sites that I've had some experience of. So there are a few flies, actually. I should have said it's mostly beetles, but there are a few flies. But I've looked at a number of different catches from vein traps and the results from them, and if the site's good, the beetles do it without the flies. There's no doubt about that. It does give you alternative methods if you can't vein trap, but you really have to work very hard to find the numbers of specimens that a vein trap will. And it tells you when to do it. One important thing to recognise with surveying this assemblage is to try and visit the site when hawthorn is flowering, because you get a lot of the deadwood beetles will visit hawthorn at that time of year. This is another one that doesn't give us a score. Well, maybe it does if it did. No, it just takes us back. The score for bark and sap with decay is 20 species. Let's look at a couple of wetland sites now. So we're going to look at what do we say, stream and river margins, W114. So this was an assemblage that previously was engineered in a slightly different way, and composed of two particular assemblages which were joined together. This sits sort of cohabits shingle banks, which is W111, but also occurs more widely along river and stream margins. Soils are often shaded by willows and tall herbs, and this humid shade appears to be an essential part of the habitat for some of the cranefly species. Very nice to always see the cranefly species mentioned in these sorts of documents. They don't get mentioned enough, I don't think, but I'm biased. The larvae of most of the craneflies are either semi-aquatic or live within saturated to damp soil. And it also mentions a few other things that live in potentially similar habitats or slightly different ones within that assemblage. So it gives you a bit of ecological information, which is quite useful. And sweeping, suction sampling seem to be the methods that we're most happy with some sweeping and time suction sampling across the finer sediments along the exposed riverine sediments. We have a default target of 6 species, so quite a small number of species there to show that the habitat is favourable. But generally, the species that you find in these sorts of assemblages are quite uncommon, or very much restricted. So they have very high fidelity to this sort of habitat. And then finally, the salt marsh, so the Morecambe Bay assemblage. Again, it had a previous name. We have W531 in a lot of our Natural England paperwork still, which could be quite confusing, but that needs to be updated. So the assemblage is characterised by species in several different taxonomic groups, but mainly beetles and 2-winged flies. quite a number of the assemblages are quite beetle heavy. So you really do need to have a coleopterist involved in assessing a lot of the assemblages. So it does help if you understand what you're aiming at before you start. Some ecological information about some of the species that are found in this particular assemblage. Some photographs of sort of typical bits of habitat that you might survey. And as with the others, sampling and assessing the assemblage gives us a little bit of information about the target groups, fieldwork methods, alternative methods, when to do it. And in this case, the default target is 9 species within this habitat, which I think changed from, I think it went up by 1 at some point. I think it was 8, but the assemblage was reassessed. I should also say at this point, before we sort of launch into playing with some data, that these default target species have a bit of an inbuilt problem with them. They were sort of put together by assessing a whole sort of range of very, very good SSSI sites, mostly, and they don't necessarily translate the whole way across England, and many of them wouldn't translate currently as they stand to Scotland. So there would be some need of sort of recalibration for that to happen. So a couple of for instances, if you survey the Dorset heaths, they are going to be far more species rich and rich of rare species than if you carry out the same sort of work on a Shropshire heathland further north, or a Lancashire heathland, or a Yorkshire lowland heath, or wherever. And in the same way that if you carry out your survey of a fen on Woodwalton Fen or somewhere else like that in Cambridgeshire, the species you find there and the assemblage is going to work a lot easier there than it does in fens further north. And a few years ago we did some work on a fen in Northumberland, fairly close to Lindisfarne, quite a far way north, well, pretty much as far north as fens go in England. And we couldn't find it favourable based on the way Pantheon works. But we felt that the site was favourable because so many of those species that we would have needed to make it favourable just currently don't occur that far north. So using Pantheon is not just about taking what it says as the gospel truth. It is infallible. And whilst it's an amazing tool, as hopefully you will see, it does need the entomologist's knowledge to support the answers it's coming up with, which is good for entomologists. It's good for skilled entomologists, so that our input is still, important. Right, we'll go to the top and we'll look at data. So taxon groups. So this is a list of everything that's in Pantheon, and it tells you the number of species. So on the top line, Aculeate Hymenoptera, known as bees, wasps and ants. There are 616 species coded into Pantheon, and that represents the full British list. And you can spend some time, if you like, going down through the figures to see how well coded your various group of interest is. So my group is the flies, Diptera, true flies. 3,597 of which are coded, but we know there are about 7,000 species in the UK, so that represents a little bit less than half. So of those that are coded, generally they are groups that we understand the ecological requirements of. So the hoverflies, the crane flies, soldier flies, robber flies, all those sorts of things are going to be in there. But some of the more difficult groups, the phorids, the fungus gnats are not yet in there. And that's actually really useful to know, because if you go and target, if you see, oh yeah, it says flies, we target the flies, and you go and target the fungus gnats on a bit of wet woodland or a bit of habitat where there's dead wood, that data may be really, really useful to the National Recorder if you can identify them or pass them on, but it's not going to help you in Pantheon. The same with tachinids. Tachinid flies aren't coded into Pantheon. So do I collect tachinid flies when I'm doing survey work for favourable condition work on SSIs? No, I don't, because there's absolutely no point. And whilst we may miss some of the rarer species because of that, because they aren't coded, we have to really sort of look at the balance of how we're going to do the survey, and it may be one of many we have to complete during a year. But in your own time, have a look through these lists. And I think one of the major advances fairly recently, if you look at the Lepidoptera, the moths and butterflies, 2,525 of which have been coded. So that whilst that's not everything, it's a reasonably big chunk of what there is. And the micro moths were fairly recently added. This is the good thing with having Pantheon as an online resource. If it was still in its old ISIS days, it would need, again, a sort of new version every time new species were coded. So what is preventing more data going on there? Time, money, expertise. It takes quite a bit of time to do this coding in terms of working out the assemblages. And also one of the things that we probably need to do at some point soon is start to recode some of the species groups. We need to take into account all the species status reviews that are ongoing. We need to look at some of them where there are errors that people have fed back on. For instance, one of the spider experts that I know doesn't have a lot of confidence in how the spiders are coded. So that possibly will need to be revisited sometime soon. But it is what it is, and it's certainly far better than with far more species than ISIS had. Likewise, you can look at how the species are coded. For any table you view in Pantheon, you can alter it around a bit. So if you don't want some of that information in your table, you sort of click on this little cross, and you can click and unclick what's important to you. So sort of for this demonstration, we will take out the vernacular name, and we'll take out the family for now, and we'll put in the specific assemblage type. We'll take out broad biotype, and we'll put in the larval feeding guild, and we apply, and it does it for us in the table. So now we have maybe the information we're most interested in, and we can go through that page by page, or we can download the full thing into an Excel table and have a play with it. And this is what what I did 10 minutes before we started, I downloaded the list and I filtered it, got rid of information I didn't want, and so now we can look at every insect that or invertebrate that makes up any particular order assemblage we want to do by filtering. So we have a list down here. So let's see, we want to look at the FO2 assemblage. So anything with FO2, we're going to click. There is some crossover with a couple of other assemblages. And now we have the list of everything in F002, which is the rich flower resource one we mentioned earlier. So that gives us a nice list we can look at, and that will sort of influence how we go about the survey. And we'll do that once more with a different. We'll say this time we'll go for the Swagnum assemblage, and that gives us an idea of exactly the species that we are looking at within the W312 Swagnum assemblage. So we've got some spiders, we've got a load of beetles as per normal, we've got a load of flies, we've got some bugs, we've got a couple of species of ants, we've got some dragonflies, we've got what's that? It's a grasshopper or cricket. I don't recognize the species name off the top of my head. We've got a pseudoscorpion, and we've got a caddisfly, and they make up the assemblage. So that informs us what we need to target when we're surveying that sort of habitat. Now, the other thing you can do is something I did to try and make bespoke species specific assemblage types for geographic areas. So I went through the W312 assemblage and I looked what part of the country every one of these species occurred in. And if I was, for instance, targeting a site in the West Midlands, anything that didn't occur in the West Midlands, I would remove. And then I'd see what I had left over and whether I thought that the species target needed to be altered downwards to take that into account, depending on how many of those species didn't occur in that part of the world. So that's a potential sort of future use for the Pantheon data, but it will save you a bit of time if you're getting to know Pantheon, to really have a look at these lists and appreciate, are these likely to be on your site? Or if you are going to survey a site, what methods do you need to employ to find rove beetles? Are you going to find them in pitfall traps? Are you going to find them by hand searching through sphagnum? Are you going to find them by netting in wet areas of sphagnum? So that will help you in your own mind find out a little bit more how to survey, basically. So we'll go back to Pantheon. So we have a species list, a very short one for this example, but nevertheless, it's a species list. Those of you who know your species will look at that and say, well, that's mostly spiders and centipedes. And it's just a little clip from a bigger list from a site somewhere. And so we're going to copy that list. We're going to go back to Pantheon. We're going to click on the Add Data button and then paste and analyze species. And that opens it up for us. We're going to paste new species. We'll put a name in for it. We'll call it Tanyptera test. And then we're going to cut and paste our list into the empty box. Then we're going to check that list, and it starts to tell us some information. So any of those species that are in green have been accepted. They're known to be correct. Any that are in red, they're going to ask us a question. So the first one is a spider, and do we think it's sensu stricto or sensu lato in the loosest sense? Well, we think it's in the strictest sense in this particular occasion. So we click on that and it turns to green. Here's something that, oh, we've spelt it incorrectly. It's actually the B. andrena fatherpeas. So we'll get rid of that and we'll insert the N, and that'll sort itself out in a minute when we check. We've got another species here of what's it called, lithobius centipede, which we've altered. We've still got that outstanding there. We check and it's been accepted. So now all of our species that we've put in are in the dictionary, the species dictionary that Pantheon uses, and we can proceed. It can be a small list, it can be many hundreds of species. It works in the same way, and you will always, pretty much always, find some inaccuracies in names. What I tend to do with species lists that I'm using, I will have inputted them into iRecord first, so that sorts the species names out. And also, as we said on the last talk, make sure that the data that we've so valuably collected, spent a lot of time surveying for, has an onward use. And then I download it back out of iRecord, so it's spelt correctly, and put it into Pantheon. So we're going to save that list, and it will be, this is a whole range of data that I have in Pantheon. It's done alphabetically. So if we go towards the end, the Tanyptera test, 26 species, and we can go and analyze that if we want to. We can save it to a public database if we want to, or we can add it to another set of data via a subgroup. So we can join up data sets. And basically you do that by clicking on the subsample, going to the top, looking in the subsample grouping, and it will tell you which of those data sets you've added together. Okay. It can sound a little bit complicated again if you've never done this before, and you sort of need to go back and have a think about how to do it. But that's the great thing about these webinars being recorded and going on YouTube, that you can watch them over and over again if you can put up with my voice for any longer. So we'll go back to my lists, and the first site that I said we would look at is Ash Ranges. So we scroll down. Here, this is the Ash Ranges survey, and what we're going to do is we actually have the 27 survey that a few of us did for the field unit, but also some extra records that came to light a little bit later. So we're going to add that to a subsample group, and then add that to a subsample group, and then go to the top, and then go to our subsample group, and it shows us those two data sets. They could be any size, they could be from any sites, anything you want to demonstrate across a landscape. And you can then analyze those two lists together, which we'll do. And this is the first thing you see. So you see that this results overview is made up of the longer ash ranges list, and then the extras have been added. So in total, we have 246 species. One happens to be a duplicate. That could be because it occurs on both of those two lists. The number of species that have been analysed is 240, and if we click that, it'll tell us what they are. But given the computer screen, it's probably easier if we click on the not analysed, so we can see them all. And there's a list of those 6 species that haven't been analysed, and they are for some reason a spider. I don't know why that species hasn't been analysed. It may not be associated clearly enough with any habitat. It may be a ubiquitous thing that we can't say is ecologically linked to any one particular habitat. We can see that the muskid here, the green muskid, is not analysed because most muskids aren't. Some are, but most aren't. A few species of tachinids. I said earlier, tachinids aren't coded, so they can't be analysed. That's generally because they are parasitic on other creatures, and those creatures generally are already coded. So there's no real need for tachinids to be coded. And then we've got a micro moth that isn't coded for some reason. I have no idea why. So we'll go back, and it tells us from our group we have 53 species of fly. And again, we can have a mess with what information we want to see. We want to see the SAT. We don't want to see the habitat broad biotype on this particular occasion, and we'll keep the associations, and it does it for us straight away. At any time for any one of these sets of lists, we can download it to an Excel table, and then we can play around with it and put it in our report at the end. It's really, really useful for doing that. And so that says we had robber flies, we had a few dolichopus probably from the wet areas. We had a number of crane flies, mostly from the wet areas. We had a range of other things, snail killing flies, a list of hover flies, and a range of other things, pitcher wing flies. So that tells us the flies we had, and we can do that the same with any other particular group. So we'll look at the dragonflies. In this particular occasion, we have a couple of nice species of dragonfly on that survey. We have the small red damselfly, which is part of the W312 assemblage. In fact, the only of those species that's part of an assemblage. There used to be, and sort of still is, before Pantheon and before ISIS, we would look at dragonflies as an assemblage in their own right, and we sort of still do, partly because it's written into a lot of the documentation, that the legal documentation that sites have for dragonfly assemblage. But that was an initial, quite early message to get across to anybody involved in looking at condition of triple SIs, that instead of just looking at one assemblage like the dragonflies, we were actually starting to look at everything across the board, and that we needed to be aware of that. So a couple of nice species of damselfly there, and dragonflies. So I'll go back to our overview. And then we've got a number of lists at the bottom with information that we could look up. So species list is a species list. We've already seen that, so we don't need to worry too much about that. We can look at the feeding guilds of those species. So we can see which are, as adults, are predators or nectivores or herbivores, etc. And we can do the same with the larvae. So if we look at the adults, that tells us that what we found has a split of that. Big chunk of predators as adults, and a reasonable chunk of nectivore or nectivorous species. And we can sort of assess what the habitat needs of our invertebrates are by using this approach, particularly with the larvae. So we've got a big chunk of predators on our SSSI. Again, with most of these things, all the tables are downloadable. You can go through them and look at which particular species are feeding on what. There's some associations. So for instance, it tells us that Coramicera marginata, a species of snail-killing fly, feeds on Cochlicopa and discus species, or it tells us that this particular grass-feeding fly, Mysa, feeds on those groups of grasses, and that might be interesting information that we can bring to the attention of the land manager if need be. We can look at the habitats in a couple of different ways. I don't intend to look at this for this site because I want to get the Attingham the Attingham Park one to demonstrate this. I don't think we're going to have time to look at everything and plan to look at, but we'll get the basics by 9 o'clock. So we'll pass that by for a little while. Probably what most people are interested in is the assemblage, and we've clicked on it and it's doing its thing. So it tells us that the species list that we collected, the F003 assemblage, which is the scrub heath and moorland one that we looked at earlier, is favourable. That 33 species were found within that SAT, and the scrub heath and moorland score you need to pass is 9, so quite significantly favourable. We have this column here, percentage representation, and generally, so that means that percentage representation of all possible species of F003 is 10%, so quite a high level. Generally, anything of 10% and above shows a very good set of species within your habitat. And it gives you a list of the rare species of conservation status that comprise that 33 species. So we'll click on the 33. So that says that actually on this site, quite a lot of important spiders were found. Anybody who knows their spiders well, Oxyopes is the lynx spider. It's only found on about 3 heathlands in the UK, and it was doing very, very well there on the Surrey Heath ash ranges. We found it all over the site and got a real feel for it. So that was really exciting. And Uloborus is another really important species found there. So to have both of them there with a range of nationally scarce species as well. So, it's probably one of the best sites for spiders in the UK. So a really, really nice site. And of course, all those uncommon things are part of the assemblage. And you go through lists like this and you can see that there's a range of things. There's a few beetles, there's some flies, there's a range of bugs that we found there, some of them relatively uncommon red data book species or nationally scarce, and a few other bits, Cubic Hymenoptera, and some moths. I'm sure you'll recognize some of those names. We've got the associations again with some of them. Where we have it, again, that's downloadable. And so you can spend a long time playing with lists once you get them in. As I say, far more than you could when it was an Excel spreadsheet. We need to be aware that anything that has a red triangle tells us that the result has been calculated from less than 15 species, so might not be entirely reliable. But actually, this particular line, the pollinator assemblage, is only a couple of species under being favourable. And if I remember correctly, on this particular job, we didn't spend a lot of time looking at the aculeates because of the weather. We had an aculeate Hymenopterus with us for one day, but it was pouring down with rain for most of it, typical Surrey. And we hardly found any bees, whereas that didn't affect our work on spiders and beetles. So that gives us a little insight into that particular site. If we want to see more than one thing on the same page, we can just click anything we want to look at randomly and submit it, and it will just whirring around, and there we have that information. And we won't really have time to go into a lot about habitat and resources on this occasion, but that information is there if you want to look at it. Right, we'll go on to Attingham. I'm particularly keen that we do this one. So paste and analyze species gets us back to our beginning page, and we will go down, and Attingham 2016. So 330 species were collected and identified, none by anyone at Natural England. So data for free. So the sample size is 328 of what was analysed, 285, 43 species weren't analysed, and they were a variety of beetles for whatever reason. I don't know why they're not coded. So back to the results overview, and again, same sort of thing. So 113 species of beetles, 101 species of flies, 35 species of true bug, 29 species of bees and wasps, and we can go on any of those and look up what they are. We can download them. We can have a play with them. But what I want to show you is these hierarchy and tabular tables, because I think they're quite fun and they tell us some interesting information. So we're going to go to the hierarchy first, and we click on that, and it separates out our list of 300 and whatever they were into species associated with trees, open habitats, wetland, things that are plant associated, things that are ubiquitous, things that are associated with dung and carrion, non-native species, etc., etc. And we can click on them, and have a look what they are. We can get a little bit of information to what some of the ecological terms mean. It won't let me go back, so I'll have to go through it again. So paste, analyze, Attingham Park. Analyze, habitats and resources, hierarchy. That gets us back in a few clicks to where we were. So probably most important to us, because we know we've got our boreal assemblages, are the tree associated ones. So if we click on that, we have a nice little neat sort of further interrogation of that data, and that tells us that 97 species of that 159 are associated with decaying wood. 36 are associated with the shaded woodland floor. 34 are generally classed as tree living or arboreal, and a few of that 159 are wet woodland species that may have just sort of happened accidentally into the traps, who knows. So we can do sort of interrogate that a bit further. We can click on the decaying wood, and it will tell us what type of decay and what type of woodlands. So sapwood and bark decay accounted for 65 of those 97 species. 21 species were associated with flowers, 18 with heart rot, fungal and fruiting bodies, 17, wood decay in soil 3, external rot holes in trees 2. As before, we can click on these and get the species lists whenever we want to. We can split it down even further and say we have 43 species associated with dead trunks and branches. The sort of bark and cambium layer accounted for 35 species of the 97, and 4 species were associated with roots and underground wood. Can we go any further? Dead trunks and branches? Yes, we can. And it's run out of space, so it takes it down the page. And that tells us that 27 species were trunks and branches, 9 were aerial branches, 6 species were associated with freshly dead wood, and only 1 species was associated with a tree stump or tree stumps. So already, just by following that hierarchy of habitats and resources, with our species list that didn't cost us anything, that we got from somebody else as a byproduct of what they were doing, we've got all this information on Attingham Park. We can go to the site managers and say, this is what we found, and this is what they're living on. And that's pretty powerful. We can demonstrate it at every stage. So we can say, these were the species that you find on, that you're going to find on the flowers, on the hawthorn in the spring, or whatever it happens to be, and download it, put it in your report. You can move around and have whichever bits of data you want. You might want to put the larval feeding guilds into it, take the associations out, take the family out, and there it tells us what the larvae are feeding on. Are they deadwood feeders? Are they predators? Do we know? So it's a really quite a powerful tool that you can't unfortunately demonstrate really in an hour and a half. But this, should start to give you an idea of how it can be used. Finally, we'll very, very quickly look at the arable margins next, and then we'll be done in a couple of minutes. So this is only part of the data set. This was from 2018, and we can analyze that. 9 species weren't analysed, and they were, again, we've got the tachinids that weren't, and a few bugs, and a few other little bits. Harlequin ladybird isn't listed. I was not sure why those robber flies aren't. They should be, but they currently aren't. Back to the results overview. And the most important thing we wanted to know was the assemblages. And we found that the bare sand and chalk was favourable just on that year's work, which started to demonstrate the value of this sort of methodology for quite important ecologically valuable sites outside of our SSSI network. So I'm sure it's got far more uses than I've demonstrated. There are going to be probably lots of questions, sort of quite technical questions, which I'm probably not that qualified to answer. But please do sign up, get yourself some data. If you don't have any species lists, I'm sure Gary can sort out some. I certainly can. I can always give you a random species list for a site or for a number of sites that I've been involved with, and you can have a play in your own time. But just to finally recap, add data, paste and analyze, paste new species list, give it a name, stick it in, check it, alter anything that's wrong. There's some, often in long lists of species, sometimes there can be typos and you have to go to Google and have a quick check. But using stuff out of iRecord is a really, really good way of doing it. And then once it's saved, you can play with it at will and start to get an understanding for how it works. And I think probably we will end there.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Pete. There was lots of parts that you were showing of Pantheon there that I'm really not very familiar with at all. Although I haven't done very much on Pantheon, but it's going to be really helpful to me, and I'm sure many other people in the audience. Particularly, I'm going to have to go back through it a few times. I think I had some small children waking up issues along the way, so I wasn't here for the whole thing. But yeah, no, it's great, and also, you know, people ask me about Pantheon occasionally, and now at least I've got something I can say. Go and watch that. Get familiar with Pantheon through you know, watching you really talk it through in some detail there, Pete, via YouTube. That's going to be a really useful way to refer them.
Yeah, I think so. And as I said, I'm clearly not going to get around everybody's queries this evening. And once people start to use it, I'm sure more queries will emerge. The video is there. As I said earlier, you know, Tanyptera will have my email address, so I can be contacted about that, and I can help if I at all can. And we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, that's very good of you, Pete. Shall we go into some questions then quickly and see how far we get? We had our first question was from Gwen, who was saying why 8 species in relation to the Swagnum Blog SAT default target species number.
The target species numbers were derived by statistical analysis based on common standards monitoring taking place on a wide range of good sites. That was before my time as to how that was derived, but there's a couple of documents that were put together by Derek Lott, who did a lot of the early testing, and people like Keith Alexander were involved, and a lot of the sort of good and great entomologists of that period of time in the 2000s. But it's been worked out by statistical analysis, and I can't tell you any more detail than that, but I know that's how it was done. I don't know whether Martin is on the call and whether Martin knows more, but that'll have to do for now from me. Okay, I can't say, you know, why 8 and not 9, why 8 and not 12. It's what the stats said.
Well, it's good to know it wasn't made up. It's obviously clearly been done, you know, in a statistical way. So great. Thank you. So go to the next question was from Steve Docker. Hi, Pete. Given the problems of species ID across multiple groups, can Pantheon be used with a partial species list or data set, e.g. a survey of beetles within a woodland and surrounding habitats?
Yes, and that's in effect what I've been doing with my landscape scale stuff. I've been trying to use groups of invertebrates that are most appropriate to a particular habitat that we're looking at in a particular part of the country. that's probably another talk for another night, because that shows some quite interesting things and interesting approaches. But you have to be aware that once you start using Pantheon outside of its original usage, which was it was originally used and designed for common standard monitoring on SSSIs, and once you start altering how you use it, you have to be aware of what the answers are. So incomplete and partial data sets are unlikely to show you that a site is favorable, in the same way that if you flood Pantheon with a whole site list, which I've done in the past for a Dorset Heath, I put everything in that had ever been recorded, and it shows that every sat assemblage possible is favorable, which clearly isn't the case. So there has to be some understanding of what it's telling you, and bear that in mind. But if you're a good ecologist or a good entomologist, you should start to be able to recognize what it starts to tell you as you become more familiar with it. And that, okay, it might not say it's favorable, but there could be reasons for that. It could be geography, like I demonstrated with the Northumberland fen, where it's never going to be favorable because it just doesn't have those species there yet. It might do in 20 years, 30 years, 50 years with climate change, who knows? But it currently doesn't. And in the same way, if you only use a partial species list, then likewise, you're not going to get the same results, but you'll get something usable. It will tell you something about the stuff you put in. And if you're putting in, survey of beetles within a woodland, like Steve suggests, well, if you use the hierarchy table, like we just did at Attingham, it will tell you something about them. It will tell you the important species and the habitats that those species are using. So it's a matter of getting familiar with it, seeing what it does, having a play.
Thanks, Pete. And I suppose for someone who is just a recorder, let's say a solitary recorder who's probably going to have a specialism in one particular group, is it going to be useful then, even if they're going to come out as unfavourable, at least if they're doing the same amount of effort at different sites, they're going to be able to compare those sites for that species group?
Yeah, obviously it works best when you're working with 3 or 4 people who've got expertise in those disciplines, as we said last time. But that's not always the case, and you can still get useful stuff out of it. Some of the assemblages, the way they're coded, so for instance, the pollinator stuff, if you only survey bees, you can still show an assemblage as favorable. But it still will tell you something of value.
Great. Okay. Thank you. A question from Andy Musgrove. Is it easy to see which Diptera families are coded in Pantheon versus which aren't? I think maybe you went through. Yeah.
That. If you download the whole list and filter it by Diptera, and then you can have a look. But it's a little difficult given there's 3,000 and something that are coded. So it'll take you a little while, but you only have to do it once. You could do a pivot table. That's exciting, isn't it? Do a pivot table with the Excel sheet and sort it by family, and that'll make it a bit easier to see.
And how is it? I think you said there's some where there's whole families that aren't in, but there's some you mentioned crane flies that just part of the group, for example, are coded. So is that how many are sort of?
Well, it was based upon the ecological knowledge we had. I was involved, but those people had at the time when they put the coding together. And also, there are some groups that are difficult and always will be difficult. And so it's quite unlikely that those groups will ever make it onto Pantheon unless somebody comes along who's able to give them context. And so that's what you need. So for instance, with the fungus gnats, you know, the leading expert in the UK and probably around Europe and other parts of the world is Peter Chandler. And he will know exactly in his head which of those species are important. And he's consequently, you know, he's writing the species status review. And when that's finished, that will probably be coded into Pantheon. But there are other groups, as I mentioned earlier, like phorids, where there's just very, very little experience. You know, anyone on the call work on phorids, chironomids, you know, all those sorts of things, which chironomids could actually be, should be really important for monitoring wetland habitats, but aren't yet coded in. So there's certainly ways in which Pantheon can develop. Every year we keep going as an organisation, Natural England, to DEFRA, the government, to try and get money to sort of develop this further, because there's a long way it can go. But in recent years, I think they'd said, you know, quite a lot of money has gone into it to date, and that, you know, we would sort of sit back for a bit and see what happens. But it's also down to you people. It's down to the entomological community to maybe take ownership of some of it as well, and try and work out new ways in which it can be used, or it's useful, or if you have an expertise in a group that isn't covered, that you know, may be one way of contributing. But hopefully within the next decade or so, it'll be a even more powerful tool than it currently is.
Okay, thanks, Pete. Andy, you did appear on a video there briefly. I was just wondering if you might have had a follow-up on that.
No, not really. No, I'll just say thanks. Yeah, it's when we saw the list of sort of higher level groups, mostly at order level, I just wondered if there was a quick way to drill down to the family level, but no, we can do it via the spreadsheet, so that's fine. Thanks.
Yeah. You can also search within the long list. You can put a genus in, or you can put a family in, and it'll do it that way. But it's probably easier having a mess and get to know the whole thing at once than you've done it. No worries.
Great. And did you happen to know when Peter Chandler is planning to finish that review? It would just be good for the current survey.
Yeah, it's in draft stage. I know I've seen. I started the cranefly one. It was in draft stage, and that was 2015. So I think there's been some issue about turning Peter's knowledge into IUCN categories, because status review. Well, we won't go into this in any detail because it's a completely different subject. But status reviews are done in a particular way and have to be done in a particular way, and that upsets some specialists who think it should be done in another way that represents their knowledge. I'm not saying one is right and one is wrong, but that's, I think, where the logjam is with this. It should come out. It should come out hopefully soon. I should my cranefly one. That's stuck in the logjam as well.
Okay. Well, hope to see them both in the near future. Okay, a question from Chloe Griffiths. Are any of the SATs particularly relevant for Wales?
Yes. Yeah, I would suggest probably a good number of them, or most of them, if not all, should work in Wales. Habitats generally are pretty similar to England. I think it's only when you get a bit further north that you encounter a species change. You get species, you know, further north in Scotland that don't occur in England and therefore won't have been coded in. But quite a number of the species, the majority of the species that occur in England could well occur in Wales somewhere or other, in the north, in the south, in the middle, wherever. So I don't see there's any reason why Pantheon couldn't be used in Wales. although it was originally designed to be used in England, and there was the hope that there would be eventual buy-in from the separate sort of country or principality bodies, and hopefully that'll happen one day, and it becomes a UK-wide bit of software that's also works regionally, so that it works well in Cornwall, it works well in wherever, based on where you are.
Okay, thanks. And another question from Steve Docker: how often is the conservation status information updated?
In recent years, it has had bits and pieces done to it when money becomes available. Anybody who works in the public sector and civil service will know that towards the end of the financial year, there's often a requirement to shift bits of money that's been underspent, and that's a sort of a typical way in which money suddenly, David or people at CEH will get a call and can you do a bit of work on Pantheon, and so it's been done piecemeal like that in recent times. But as I said earlier, there is the requirement to get more funding to do more work on it. So it's sort of slowed down a bit, but it has come a long way since ISIS. So I don't think we can be too unhappy with how things have developed.
No, and so it's nobody's particular job at the moment. It just as and when funding comes available. That's
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, another question from Gwen: how important is SQI?
Right. Well, it used to be far more important than it currently is because we've lost the broad assemblage types, but it still is a way of trying to identify what those former broad assemblage types were by the score. And that is a whole new, probably hours discussion. So I think I'm going to politely decline to go any further with that at this stage, if that's okay, Gwen.
Okay, thanks. Well, I don't think I think Gwen might have gone anyway, so I can't see her.
Okay.
So okay, so that's fine. Thank you. Okay, another question from Andy Musgrove. How does one cope with the fact that longer periods of recording will inevitably produce longer lists? Are there recommended maximum allowable amounts of effort?
Well, it's still, if you think back to the assemblage lexicon that we looked at earlier, it sort of does say that you should survey at certain times of the year, and generally 2 or 3 visits are recommended for those particular habitats. And Andy's absolutely right. As I said with the Dorset Heath work, I wanted to see what would happen if I put 4,000 records from a Dorset heathland in, and it just showed everything was favourable. And clearly that's not the case. So you have to recognise a sort of balance. Obviously, the thing was designed with common standards monitoring in mind, but who carries out common standards monitoring these days? Not that many people. So you have to recognise that is going to be the case, and sort of balance how you the sort of level of data you put in. So what I've tended to do in times gone by is, if we've been unable to survey, but there's a reasonable historical data set, I might look at a 10-year data set and put that in, which might sort of represent a balance for that particular site, or a 5-year one. It is really difficult to have complete confidence in that sort of methodology. But as an experienced entomologist, you sort of have a feel after a while of whether a particular habitat or feature is in fact favourable. Have you put too much in there? Have you not put enough in there? Have you not got, you know, many species on your list? And it becomes a bit of a balance. And so it all comes with that sort of caveat that if you're not doing common standards monitoring, you may need to look a little bit longer at the outcomes and put some documentation into your report to explain what's going on. And anything that allows an entomologist to do that, I think, is a good thing. In the same way, last time we talked about DNA and how that technology is advancing. It still needs some sense checking from experienced entomologists. And this also sort of brings up, you know, you could be putting DNA lists in to Pantheon in the future from survey work that's been done on sites, and getting some sort of outputs based on DNA lists. It could be all sorts of things.
Okay, great, thank you. Thanks very much, Pete. I think we have one last question in the chat, and then maybe we'll give a chance for anyone to speak any final questions. So this one was from Dave B. Can you say more about the rationale for excluding parasitic groups? They're useful for detecting hosts that are easily overlooked, evaluating functional diversity and habitat quality, e.g. tanichids, as metrics of restoration of communities. Accepted that parasitica would be impractical, but tachinids and other Ostroidea, I'm probably saying that wrong, are tractable groups to work on and are widely used in ecological research.
Probably a fair point, Dave. You would have to take that up with Natural England and CEH. And I suppose if there was a clamour, you know, for the tachinids to be coded, I'm sure someone like Chris Raper could probably do it, or Matt Smith from the recording scheme. But I suppose it's like everything else. You know, it's a balance. They've chosen to go with the species they have the most experience with in the first instance, and made the decision that maybe hoverflies and other groups of flies were more useful, and that tachinids weren't. But that could be a conversation that could follow in time. So keep shouting about it, Dave.
Yeah, I would think, especially where the ecology is really well known, where the hosts are really well known and they're specialists, then it's clearly, if you can detect those the parasite but you don't detect the host, then that's still quite a valid score. Okay, well, I think that is all the questions that I can see from the chat. So thank you, everyone. Really interesting.